Hello and welcome to the Husband Help Haven podcast, where you'll learn how to be the best husband you can be no matter what your marriage is like right now. This is your host, Stephen Waldo, and today we are going to be talking about how to build from friendship to attraction once your wife has started coming back to the relationship, coming back to the marriage. This is going to be a bit of a follow-up on the last episode that we did about how to get out of your wife's friend zone. Now, if you haven't listened to the last episode, I would recommend that you go back and do that because it's going to be a little bit of a required listening, if you will, before we get into this one, because basically I had some additional thoughts, and specifically this was prompted by a few conversations that I've had with men over the past couple weeks, actually, and just a few situations I've seen come up. And this is typical where, let me just start by setting the baseline here. Where are we coming from? So you'll remember in the last episode, we talked about getting out of your wife's friend zone. And specifically, we talked about how the friend zone, in my view, doesn't actually describe the problem correctly, because the situation that we're often talking about there is actually one of mismatched attraction. And in addition to that, not only is there a mismatched level of attraction, you're more attracted to your wife than she is to you, but your wife has a very clear awareness of it. So she's very aware that you are more attracted to her than she is to you. She believes she already kind of knows how she feels about you. And so we talked about how the way out of that, it can be by kind of challenging how much more attracted she thinks you are to her, and basically like by withdrawing a little bit, by being a little bit more natural in your communication with her, and really just checking your motives to make sure that you're not openly using the friendship as a means to an end, as a way to get your wife to feel differently about you. Because that's where you get into trouble. When she can feel that you're doing that, when the friendship serves a certain purpose for you, and it's not just friendship, it's something more, that's where you kind of get stuck in this friend zone. And so I described two situations in a separation where I think this comes up a lot. The first one is basically in the very early stages of a relatively mild separation where your wife doesn't quite know what she wants. And so a lot of life still feels relatively normal, but she's very clear that she is not happy in the marriage and she is considering leaving, at least, if not outright saying, I'm planning to leave. The second one is where she's maybe just recently moved out, but you still have very frequent contact with her and a lot of life still remains normal. She still comes by the house all the time, multiple times a week. You text all day, every day. You are very friendly. You have dinners together, stuff like that. You're still hanging out with the kids if you have them. That's the other situation, and this is where men tend to get stuck in the friend zone, as we talked about. So go back and listen to that last episode. But there's another situation where the issue of growing the relationship from friendship to something more comes up, and that's actually late in a separation. And specifically the situation I'm envisioning here, and this happens a lot, and probably some of you listening to this are in this spot right now, where your wife has kind of had her journey away from the marriage. She left, she was separated, maybe physically, she moved out. And maybe she's not even moved all the way back in, but she's seeming to come back. And it now seems like, legitimately, there is a question as to the outcome of the separation. It's no longer just dead set on divorce. Maybe she's even moved back in. You guys are starting to hang out again. And maybe you've even agreed that you're kind of working on the marriage, or at least that that's the plan to do that eventually. And so you're kind of working on things, but not really working on things. And so you get stuck in this spot where it feels like you've gotten over the worst of it, but can't seem to improve the relationship from friendship or roommate even to romantic marriage. And that's kind of the sticking point. So with that, that's a little bit of a different situation than the two that we talked about last time. And so I thought today I would talk a bit about that, because I think that the things you might do there are a little bit different than the ones that we described last week. Again, the ones that we described in that last episode were about, basically just being more aloof, being a little bit more of the mystery man, if you're familiar with that, if you've been through Peace and Control, that sort of thing. But what about courtship? What about the more proactive approach here? What if what your wife needs is not a less intense emotional connection with you to make room for her to grow, but maybe a more intense emotional connection with you that sort of magnetizes her into the relationship? And so you probably know whether this is the camp that you're in or not. Again, if your situation kind of fits what I just described, that she's kind of come back but hit that sticking point, and that sticking point might be friendship or kind of partnership, but not romantic. How do you move past that? How do you push through that part of reconciliation? If it's going to go that direction, how do you keep things moving? So I wanted to talk about that today, and there's a few things that I find myself suggesting to men pretty frequently when they're in this sort of situation. So we're going to talk through that today. Hopefully this will be helpful for you, and if you're not here yet, still I think listening through this will give you ideas for when you get there, or if you, surprise, surprise, end up having a few good moments with your wife, you can kind of have your eyes open, your ears open for looking for some of these sort of things. So let's go ahead and get into them. When all the other pieces are there, when your wife is seemingly on the way back, she maybe is even living with you and maybe has even stated that she would like to make things work, how do you progress through this sticking point that seems to come up a lot of friendship, of partnership, into a more romantic place? Well, the baseline thing to remember here, if you're in this situation, is that your job during this time is to continue to fill your side of the mutual love loop. So if you've read through Manly Marriage Revival, you'll remember this concept that we talk about pretty early on in the book about the mutual love loop. And there's also a post on Husband Help Haven that you can go and check out, and I'll put that in the show notes for this episode, which is husbandhelphaven.com/friendship-to-attraction. So go and check that out if you want to see a little bit more about that. But the basic idea is that the more genuinely loved that a person feels, the more naturally they feel the urge to reciprocate that love back to you. It's kind of like, I grew up, I did a lot of wrestling, and one of the things that they teach you in wrestling, or really any grappling sport, judo, jiu-jitsu, things like that, is that if you are trying to set up a throw, so you're trying to hip somebody up off the ground and throw them over onto the mat, what they tell you to do is not just start by picking them up and trying to throw them. First, you actually push into them, because by pushing into them, the natural urge is for them to push back against you, and then you can utilize their momentum, their effort that they're putting in to match what you're doing, to kind of put them where you want them on the mat in wrestling. But in this analogy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to model, in your marriage rather, what we're trying to do is model what it looks like to pour into a relationship, what it looks like to love your spouse in the relationship. You're kind of teaching that by example. If this is where you're at, and again, this does not apply to everybody who is separated. This does not apply to every relationship that is in crisis. I'm talking again about the men who are trying to build back from friendship to something more. A way that you can do that, a general approach, is to try and lead the way in loving well, in forgiving well, in extending grace well. So you're trying to model this stuff for your wife. That's the basic premise here. So the first thing that you can look to do here is incorporate mild but meaningful physical affection and kind of lead the way in this. So for example, you're walking behind your wife in the kitchen, a gentle hand on the hip as you pass behind her, a stroke of her arm, looking at her, kind of offering a massage if she's feeling tired or has a headache or something like that. Being content with even just giving your wife a side hug or holding her hand or opening the door for her. These just little small acts of affection. They might be a little bit awkward at first, especially if you are on the way back from separation and that you're still early in this reconciliation process. They might feel a bit awkward at first, but again, kind of press through that and be open to being rejected, because that might happen sometimes too. Don't lose it if she rejects these small physical acts of affection, and obviously adjust accordingly if she does. But again, the idea is that you're kind of leading the way. You're getting her used to feeling you touch her, and vice versa, hopefully. Again, similarly, we talk about these little micro touches. Also, praise her, see her. Find ways to appreciate what she's doing. A common frustration that a lot of men have when they're in this position in their relationship is that their wife isn't putting in enough work. Well, with this, the side benefit of not only making your wife feel encouraged and loved and valued and important as a person, not just as a wife, not just as a role filler in the family or in the relationship, but actually her uniquely filling that role and being the person that you want to be in that role in your life and kind of making her know that, that's good. And it forces you to have that perspective that your wife is actually doing important stuff. So if you believe that your wife is doing absolutely nothing, and you're the only one who's carrying the relationship, but maybe she is actually doing some things and you just can't see them, this forces you to kind of get creative and see what those things might be. And maybe even give your wife the benefit of the doubt in some areas that you otherwise might not be able to. So again, whether it's with a sweet little note, a quick little compliment, again, consistent verbal affection, just trying to build it back into the relationship and leading by example. Now, obviously, again, there's some danger here. Just like with the physical affection, she can reject you there. She can turn her cheek when you go in for a kiss. She can kind of nudge you away when you go for a hug. She can tell you that it makes her uncomfortable. You have to be prepared for that and, again, adjust. Same thing here. She can be reminded, instead of feeling loved by this, especially if you're very clear about your ulterior motives or she's not in the place where you think she might be, she might just be reminded that she doesn't feel that way about you. And then we're right back where we started in that last episode. So if that happens, you have to be able to take it, roll with it, be unfazed by it. And again, this kind of speaks back to what your motive needs to be in this whole process, which is it's not about changing anything about her. It's about doing your best to be the husband that you want to be during this time. And if you're in the place in your relationship where you're on the way back, or you think you might be on the way back to a good relationship with your wife, then what your wife needs from that husband is different than the wife who's still on her way out and still in the midst of those hard separated feelings and very cold about the relationship and things like that. So again, your goal is to be the best husband that you can, and that's why you're saying these things or doing these things for your wife. And so therefore, if you get a bad reaction or she tells you to stop or whatever, having that good motive going into it makes it easier to take that and roll with the punches. And that kind of speaks to this other thing that I will remind you of here, if you're in this place, which is that stop needing your wife to love you. Now, I know that this is almost impossible to avoid. Your that ulterior motive of trying to get her back. You just want the marriage back. There's no avoiding it. So, of course, it's going to seep in every now and then, unavoidably so. And it can actually be harder to keep those expectations and those motives in check in this phase of the relationship because you are trending in the right direction. You've seen positive steps with your wife. You have a reason to expect things to move forward because you've seen it happen already. And yet, once that feeling of needing to be in control again starts creeping back into what you're doing, that's where you're going to get into trouble. When you need an outcome to happen to feel satisfied or like you've done a good job, that turns the outcome, which is something out of your control fundamentally, into the object of your focus and your effort. And that gets us right back to where we started at the start of separation. It's the very first thing we talk about for most men when we come to Husband Help Haven. Stop focusing on what you can't control and focus on what you can. So if you are in this place where you're very frustrated with your wife because she can't seem to do the right things in the relationship, the things that are so obvious that she should be doing to move things forward, or if maybe she is trying and you accept that she's trying, but it just doesn't seem to be going anywhere, first try to get that mental reset. Remind yourself what you can control, and that your wife is not one of those things. And then think about ways that you can lead in the relationship, whether that's through verbal affection, physical affection, or maybe this is where you're at. It's time to be bold and actively court her and actively pursue her. Maybe there's a way that you can do something bold that's not outright romantic. Maybe it's a family picnic. Maybe it's a shopping trip together. Maybe it's picking out that new furniture. Maybe it's going to a concert. Maybe it's, insert whatever. But the point is that you're initiating time together and maybe even being explicit that the time together you're seeking with her is time together. It's time with each other, intended to help you build the relationship. Now, again, when you're seeking this time together and you're kind of proactively looking to court your wife into spending more time with you by asking for it, by being explicit that that's what you want, depending where things are at, you may need to, even as you're speaking the language of romance, set your expectations on the time together of friendship and that kind of being the quality of the time together, that's okay. Again, if you remember back to another podcast that I've done that's similar to what we're talking about today, it's Get Your Wife Back with Friendship. Again, I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode on husbandhelphaven.com/friendship-2-attraction. But the point is that just getting good quality time together and just getting comfortable with each other and both of you relearning that you can have enjoyable time together and be happy with each other, that is a very powerful thing for rebuilding trust in the relationship and getting your wife to a point where she feels able to be vulnerable in leaning into the relationship and pursuing not just staying with you, but actually loving you and enjoying being in a relationship with you. Nothing terribly groundbreaking that we're talking about here, but hopefully putting it into perspective is helpful. The things that we've covered so far: small physical acts of affection, small verbal affection. Go check out the love languages, 5 love languages. If you've never read that, go Google it. It's available everywhere. Plenty of people have talked about it. I'm not going to talk about it a bunch here. You can go look it up. Be creative. And then the other thing that we talked about was being a little bit bold and asking for time together and initiating time together and seeking that out. With the language of romance, the language of almost dating, even if it's not quite to that point when you're actually spending the time together. All those are things that you can be looking to do. And again, the overall goal, the thing that the premise here is that we're finding ways to pour love into the relationship in a way that matters to your wife, that's well received by your wife, and we're just keeping the faucet on until she succumbs to that natural urge to reciprocate, right? Until she feels that she's ready to do that, to let herself do that. And that process can take a long time. 2 other things that I want to leave you with here, because both of these are very important to bear in mind. The first one is to remember, at some point she has to lean in. She has to make that choice. That's just the reality. You cannot single-handedly carry the marriage. You just can't. For many of the men in this situation, the reality is that their wife is still somewhat just along for the ride, and maybe she's even still figuring stuff out. She hasn't maybe fully addressed her own stuff in this separation. She might be willingly along for the ride. She might be glad to be along for the ride, and perhaps in a way that's part of the problem. A lot of times I'll see a wife in this situation and it feels like she's just waiting for the husband to make her feel in love, to make her feel loved again, or to make her feel that urge to love again. And therefore she tells herself, if she doesn't love you again, if she doesn't have that feeling back, then it must be because you aren't doing quite the right things yet. And you need to keep iterating. You need to keep trying. You need to keep making things different. But the reality is that's not how it works. You love things that you willingly and deliberately put your time and energy into. That's why love, it's not just a noun, it's a verb. It's something you do. You do it to feel it. And on top of all that, there may still be some legitimate forgiveness, that needs to happen for your wife to come back. And again, all of this is okay. And that kind of brings me to the second point that I wanted to kind of end things with, which is that I highly encourage you to get all of the shoulds out of your head for what this reconciliation or what this journey, if you're still not certain where it's going to go, is supposed to look like. The timeline, the actions, what she should be doing, what you should be doing, the things that you should be doing as a couple if you want to end up at outcome X, staying together. Lead by example. Love her unconditionally. Pour out your love for her with the hopes that she will desire to reciprocate. And because it's what you want to do as a husband, you feel that it's the right thing to do for where you are at. That's what your wife needs from you right now. But as you're doing that, don't get into a game of comparison of what you're doing versus what she's doing. Instead, assume that if she's back, if she's made any progress back to the relationship from where she was at one point, assume that she is trying. Somewhere in there, she is trying. You might not see it. Chances are, part of that is because there are some things that you still need to work on to be able to see her clearly and see her emotionally where she's at clearly, her emotional capabilities clearly. So there might be some of that, but even if there's not, even if you are perfectly aware and you have an accurate awareness of what your wife is doing, there's going to be things that you don't see, that you have no way of detecting. that she is doing inside her mind, inside her heart. So be patient, give her the benefit of the doubt, assume that she is trying, even if you can't see it. Again, remind yourself of the evidence that you've seen that there has been effort somewhere. Whatever positive change, whatever positive trajectory you've built up from where you were at when things were really bad to where you are right now, remind yourself that there has been some progress, and then content yourself. Use that reminder to content yourself with things moving slowly and maybe not in a perfectly linear and perfectly accelerated trajectory back to the relationship that you think and might rightfully think you could have if she would just do X and Y and Z. That might be true, but she has to want it before she can do it. And if she's not ready to want it, it means something yet isn't right. So be patient, keep doing what you think you should be doing, stay focused on what you can control, and release her to go through this process in the way that she wants to. By choosing to pursue her and by choosing to stand for your marriage and continue trying to save your marriage, even when you're the only spouse trying, part of that choice is taking ownership of these consequences, of saying, I know that this hurts, I know that it's unfair, I know that I'm going through this rejection, and this isn't fair at all because I'm the one who's doing the right thing and she's not. You could say that, and you could get very frustrated. And you might even be right in saying those things. You might be right in saying those things. But that's not a helpful way to think. And you will be much happier if you say instead, by choosing to be the one to stay for this marriage, by choosing to pursue my wife even when she wanted divorce, I am also choosing to take on and forgive her imperfect decisions through this process, provided they don't breach the serious boundaries that I may have, like fidelity or something like that. Or time, if you have a timeline. If you have your own internal timeline, again, that's fine. And that's kind of a conversation for another time about what those boundaries could be. The point is, your wife might go through this process and it might be messy. Give her grace to do that. Lead the way, lead by example, be the rock, be strong, set that good foundation, show her what it looks like to pour into the relationship as much as you think she's capable of receiving, and then release her to do the part that she needs to do. So I hope that helps you guys. Again, I know that this is a tough place to be in, and I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had with men who are in this sort of position, and the thing that they will tell me is that this part where it seems like she's coming back, but then he gets stuck, is almost worse than the part where you're just trying to get her to come back at all, because there's so many. It's like those expectations from the very start of the separation come right back, and you don't realize it because you think things are going in a good direction, and so you kind of are blind to it. But it's those very same feelings. So if that's you, it's okay. Take that reset. Think about what your wife needs right now, and keep moving forward, focused on what you can control. And if you feel like you might just be at the end of your rope and you can't keep going anymore, and you're in this situation because it's just too unfair, hold on, because next week we're going to have a conversation about reasons to continue waiting in your separation. So stay tuned for that. Until then, thank you guys for listening. As always, it's been Stephen from Husband Help Haven, signing off with much manly love. I'll see you guys next